Okay, so you're new to apologetics and you want to learn some of the basics about how to provide some good reasons for what you believe and why you believe. And perhaps you're just a little overwhelmed with all the information out there. You're not sure where to begin. So in this clip, I want to go over some of the basics, or as far as some of the reading suggestions that I've come up with. I kind of bracket these into beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Now, obviously, some people are going to look at some of these books. If they read them, they might say, oh, no, that's not a beginner book, or that is a beginner book, or that should be advanced, or I don't really consider that to be immediate. So that's kind of subjective, and so I don't really want to debate that point too much, but these are some of my picks. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to go over every book that's ever been written, but if I was starting in apologetics, just trying to build my knowledge base, this is where I would begin. Now, there's no doubt that you can't be a specialist in everything. That means that you cannot learn every topic. And of course, nobody requires you, or God doesn't even require you to be an expert in philosophy, theology, science, um, history, biblical studies, biblical languages, um, cultural analysis, all those things. You can't learn everything, and you can't be an expert at everything. So I think you can just start out with learning some of the basics on how to discuss God's existence. Of course, you should be able to give reasons for God's existence without the Bible. And as long as you learn how to talk about the resurrection, talk about why Jesus is unique, learning some of those basics is the starting point. Now, if you want to move on and specialize in one or more areas, that's up to you. A lot of people have done that where they found something that really motivated them to go deeper, and so they picked a certain topic like the resurrection or the problem of evil or something, and they have become specialists in that area. So you'll have to decide what to do with that. That's going to be up to you as you move forward here. So I would say on a beginner level, that the book "I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist" by Turk and Geisler is probably one of the best books to start out with. It has a nice little outline here where they build on each point because they don't want to beg the question. They start with truth, and then they talk about the laws of logic, and then they obviously start with some evidence for God outside the Bible because they're classical apologists, and then they work their way into history, talking about miracles. Then they go into history with the New Testament, who Jesus is. But um, the book is, I think, at a beginner level, a general apologetics book. The concepts are there. You can learn some of the concepts. There's a lot in there, a lot of information, but I think this outline is very helpful. So I would definitely recommend that as a starting point. And then Frank Turk wrote another book that came out a ways later called Stealing from God, where he talks about features of reality that only make sense on the belief in God. Everybody sees these same features of reality. They're not even debated whether these features of reality exist. The issue is what explains them better, atheism or theism. And he's talking about in that book how people probably are borrowing from God on a daily basis in their lives. They're living off God's reality or living in God's reality. They just haven't recognized it. And so that book kind of builds on that thesis right there. And I think that's a very good book as well. Another beginner book that has a lot of different essays in it on a lot of different topics are 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science. As I said, that's a series of essays by different authors, but the essays are very short. There's a lot in there, a lot of information. Like I said, they're not extensive essays. They're short, but there's still a lot of good information there. So I'd say that book is obviously in a beginner level too. And then similar to that book is Who Made God, and answers to over 100 and other tough questions of faith. That's a general apologetics book that just has a lot of different questions, and it covers a lot of different topics such as world religions, such as common questions to God's existence. It's edited by Ravi Zacharias and Norman Geisler. They do write some of the essays in it, but it's written by many different authors, so that's a good introductory book as well. In building on that, I would say if someone was to start on a book by Ravi Zacharias, I think Beyond Opinion, Living the Faith We Defend is a good book because, once again, it is a series of essays by different people on different topics. It's quite varied. So that's where I would start. If someone comes to me and asks me if I like Ravi Zacharias, I would say, sure, I like Ravi Zacharias. I don't think all his books are equal. I think some of them are better than others, but I think this book was one that's a good starting point for you to learn some of the basics of the arguments that are out there. All these Strobel's books here are all on an introductory and beginner level. Of course, these books have done very well. Of course, there's been criticisms. One thing that I have noticed about these books is that when Strobel interviews people, people complain. They say, well, he only interviews people who believe in God. Well, not necessarily. In his latest book, The Case for Miracles, he does not do that. He has an atheist, and he interviews Michael Shermer in that book in one chapter. But the point is that he generally gives the other side. He always asks who he's interviewing. He gives them the objections that he hears from atheists and skeptics. And so I think that he allows the other side to be heard in these books. So I could say that many of the questions in these books are things I've heard over the years, many of the topics. By the way, you can get all these books on audio, just like a lot of the books I'm mentioning here if you're an audio listener. So, of course, these books are well known, and those are good starting points if you just want to learn the basics and some of the issues that are out there. Also, Paul Copon's book are written on an introductory or general level. All these books have really good information in them. They're very systematic, kind of pretty concise, but he covers so many different topics in these books, and I think that they're all good starting points for you as far as all these books. I don't agree with probably every single thing he says in these books, but that's the way it goes with the territory. But there's a lot of good information in these books, and these are really good starting points. He's a philosopher, but he's able to combine some cultural apologetics with the philosophy, and of course he's well read in biblical objections as well. So there's a wealth of information in these books. I would say if you're starting with the William Lane Craig book, I'd say On Guard is one that's written on more in a beginner, intermediate level in between there. If you're going to get his Reasonable Faith book, which I'll talk about in a minute, this is written as more as a digestible version of Reasonable Faith, more something that the beginner can understand. So that's a good book if you want to start learning about some of William Lane Craig's apologetic information. Of course, he's one of the most well-known apologists that are out there, and probably go down the last 50 years as the most famous Christian apologist and someone that's defended the faith on so many levels, so many debates. Gregory Gansel's book, Thinking About God, First Steps in Philosophy, is a really good book to learn some of the basics of philosophy. It's not a philosophy textbook, but the way he lays out the arguments in there, he uses syllogisms and talks about counter objections and using logic, deductive arguments, inductive arguments, things like that. So that's a good book, and I highly recommend that book because I think philosophy is so important. As far as learning with apologetics, you need to learn some philosophy. Of course, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis has to be on here. That is one of the most famous books that's been written, but it's still one of the best books ever that has ever been written about defending the faith, or just some of the basics. I read this book when I was a new believer. It transformed my life, I know, early on. So anyway, that has to be on the list. If you don't have that, that's a must read. J. Warner Wallace's book, these books have come out over the last 10 years. James Warner Wallace is a former atheist, cold case detective. He takes his detective skills and uses them to investigate the existence of God and, of course, evidence for Jesus in the New Testament. These are really I think they're laid out very well. He's got a lot of really cool illustrations in them because he's an architect by training. He does all his illustrations. But his where he has excelled is how to explain what evidence is. I think a lot of us are dealing with people, they don't really know how to evaluate evidence. And of course, he would know because he's been a cold case detective. He talks about the difference between direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, inferential evidence. So I think these books are really exceptional, and I hope that you would plow into these, especially the one on the right. I know the one on the right, Cold Case Christianity, I think is going for nothing on Kindle right now. You could pick that up for free on Kindle. A couple books that have a little more philosophy in them are R.C. Sproul's The Consequences of Ideas and the Universe Next Door by James Sire. It's so important to know the worldviews out there and to know the different idea structures that are influencing the way people think. I would say that these two books are a good starting point. James Sire's book is now in the 5th edition, but that is the classic on learning worldviews. You need to learn a worldview. You need to build your worldview, know the worldview questions, know the other worldviews that are out there. Very, very important. Gregory Kokel's book Tactics, the 10th anniversary edition, has come out. This is a great book just to learn how to use good tactics when you're defending your faith. It has some apologetics in it, but it's really a lot about talking about how to go about asking the right questions, asking the right apologetic questions, mistakes we make, listening well, communication issues. So highly recommended, and that's definitely the updated and expanded version that's come out. And then we have my book, along with my friend Chris Van Allsburg. We have a short book we wrote called Does God Exist? Why It Matters. It's about 75 pages. It's on Kindle and paperback, but we both have done campus apologetics for several years now. We've heard a lot of objections, talked to a lot of people. So one thing that comes up sometimes, whether God is relevant, whether believing in God is relevant, whether it really matters. Well, that's what we talk about in this book. And some people think they can just get away from the God question. It'll just go away, but it doesn't go away, because if God exists, he's going to exist tomorrow, the next day, and the next day. 50 days from now, 500 years from now, 50 years from now, whatever. The point is that God's existence does not go away if he's there. And so we talk a little bit about some of those issues in this book. J.P. Moreland's books are very helpful. The God Question, his book on philosophy made slightly less difficult, is another good introduction to philosophy. And his updated version of Love the Lord Your God with All Your Mind is an excellent book. That's one of the books I first read when I got into apologetics. It really transformed my thinking. So I highly recommend these books as well. And then the newer version of Evidence that Demands a Verdict came out over the last 2 to 3, 5 years. This is with updated information by Josh McDowell's son, Sean McDowell, updated arguments, which were much needed. So this is definitely a requirement for anyone's library. They deal with all kinds of topics in this book, and so I highly recommend. Of course, it's evidential apologetics, but that's what Josh McDowell was known for. He's an evidentialist, and Sean is taking the same approach in this book. Mostly deals with a lot of issues in that, dealing with the Old Testament, New Testament, some philosophy, some arguments for God's existence, some other issues. So there's a bunch of different authors in that book as well. It's not just written by Josh and Sean. As far as Norman Geisler, he was like the grandfather of apologetics. One of the first books he ever wrote back in the 70s was called Christian Apologetics. I still think that's one of his best books he did on the topic. He's a very general apologist, but he's written over 50 books. I think his big book of Christian Apologetics should be in anyone's library. It has all kinds of topics in that. Of course, there's short little essays, short little dictionary entries, but that's definitely a must read, or you need that in your library at least. But if I was to start with a Norm Geisler book, I would start with Christian Apologetics, the one he wrote back in the 70s. I thought that was pretty well written for what it was. And of course, he's updated it here before he passed away most recently. Now, if you want to learn the different reasons for the need for apologetics, and of course, they have some other different, they talk about arguments for God and some of the approaches apologists use. I'd recommend Bowman and Boa's book here, Faith Has Its Reason, Integrative Approaches to Defending the Christian Faith. This is written more on an intermediate level. But if you really want to know why it's important to defend your faith and the different apologists that have been doing it for a long time and the different approaches, that's an excellent textbook. Another book that's an excellent book is this book, Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith by Douglas Groothuis. He is a professor at Denver Seminary, philosopher. He's written some other books, but that is really extensive. I love the way it lays out a lot of good information in there. Very thick book, but well worth it if you can get that book. Highly recommend it. If you want to start on the resurrection, I would say these two books are a good starting point. I think they're written on an understandable level, or general level, or beginner level. That is Habermas's and Lacona's A Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And then the book Did the Resurrection Happen? A conversation with Habermas and Anthony Flew. That was kind of a debate book they did that they updated. And then there's some afterward some comments at the end by David Badgett. But that was where I would start if I was going to study the resurrection. Start with those two books right there. Also, on the moral argument, if you're starting out, I'd recommend the book The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God, which came out over the last few years. And Relativism, Firmly Planted in Midair by Beckwith and Kokel. The moral argument is a huge apologetic issue, and we need to be able to talk about why we think God is the best explanation for moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability. So that's a good starting point with those two books right there. A couple other intermediate books. I want to recommend Edward Fazer's book, The Last Superstition. He used to be an atheist as well. Now he's known as a very well-known philosopher, a Thomist. Fazer is Catholic, but this book obviously covers a lot of philosophical issues. I thought this was kind of refreshing to get back into some Thomistic and Aristotelian thought here. So I guess I give that book an intermediate. If you're not familiar with the concepts, that may be new to you. It may be new to you, but it's well worth reading. As well as Joshua Rasmussen's book here, Philosopher's Bridge to Faith, God, about reason, God can lead to reason. I read this last year, and it really does a lot with the contingency argument, how God is the foundation of existence, or explains existence. And so I'm going to give this an intermediate ranking if you're not used to some of the concepts, but I highly recommend this book. He's doing some excellent work in philosophy and elsewhere if you want to watch some of his YouTube clips. Also, William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith, third edition, I consider that to be an intermediate level. Very extensive book. Of course, as I said, Dr. Craig's going down as probably one of the most prolific Christian apologists over the last 50 years, and that was his updated version of that book. So got to have that in your library. And then if you want to move on to some advanced reading where you want to be challenged and you find that you want to move beyond some of the basics, I'd recommend any of these books: Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview by Craig and Moreland, Robert Spitzer's book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. Some of those chapters are hard to understand if you don't have training in modal logic. Edward Fazer's book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. That's a lot of philosophy in there. And then In Defense of Natural Theology. So all these books are going to move you forward. They may challenge you a bit at first, but don't be intimidated. That's how you grow. So if you want to go more into the advanced category, that's what I would start with some of these books. And of course, you want to read books eventually that present both sides, because as we know in all apologetics, whether it be atheistic apologetics, Islamic apologetics, Mormon apologetics, or Christian apologetics, whatever it is, it can always lead to confirmation bias, where you basically just keep seeking out things to confirm what you want to believe. And so you want to hear both sides of the argument, and that's why some of these books are important. You can hear the other side in some of these books where they debate some of the big questions you hear from both atheists and Christians and theists and skeptics. So I would recommend eventually going into that direction. You want to hear both sides and it'll sharpen your skills. But some of these are kind of advanced, but I certainly believe that they're important because you do want to read both sides of the argument. And then finally, with the resurrection, I think that Mike Lacona's book here is a amazing piece of work, but that is definitely advanced reading. It's over 700 pages, I think. But that was his dissertation. If you want to go deeper on the resurrection and want to get into some advanced topics, that would be it. So those are some of my suggestions for now if you're getting started. I'm sure that there's many more out there I could have mentioned, but I think for now that'll get you going, and I hope that you take the time to study hard and learn some of this stuff, because it will pay off in your conversations with others, and also it'll build your own faith up, and you'll have a better understanding of what you believe and why you believe and how to apply that in the world around you. Have a good day.